This tip is about the biggest learning lesson I've ever had in my entire life when it comes to business. And the learning lesson is, what's the risk? Story on this one. My little startup company, we got acquired by Staples. It was a $10 million startup company. We got acquired by a $20 billion organization. I was 25, 27 years old, I think, when we were being acquired. We were such a young management team. And so we didn't know what to do. So we had a consultant come in and talk to us about what happens and what do we need to say so we don't screw this up. And I'm about as transparent as it gets. I'm a really bad liar, but I was a minority shareholder, so I didn't want to screw this up. So they told us what to say, basically. Now the president of a $12 billion part of Staples came and interviewed the executive team one by one. And he asked, okay, so what do you guys think? John, so what do you think of the acquisition? And I was like, oh, great. And I basically said what I was told to say. And it was evident, this guy, Jay, he obviously saw right through me. And afterwards, he didn't have a very good impression of me. And so, but my CEO fought for me and kept me on board there. Fast forward, the perception didn't get any better. And ultimately, I was fired a year later. And I was devastated. But what I did was I reached back out to Jay. And I said, Jay, after the dust settled a little bit, I said, Jay, for my own personal and professional development, would you mind if I just grab, an hour of your time just to ask you some questions so I can learn from this experience? And his response was unexpected, to say the least. He said, John Barrows, get in here. He goes, you know what? One of my favorite things to do is to mentor young leaders. And the fact that you reached out to me and asked me for feedback tells me more about you than I knew in the year working with you. You have an hour of my time, ask me whatever question you want. And so I had come prepared with 10 questions. I said, Jay, you can, answer as many of them as openly and honestly as you want. If not, I understand. He's like, nope, here we go. And one of the questions was, Jay, would you have been open to a meeting like this when I had worked for you in the past, where we had this conversation? He said, of course I would. Why wouldn't I? I was like, well, I was kind of told that I wasn't allowed to speak to you because, my CEO was scared that I'd get fired because, I don't have much of a filter here. And he goes, John, I'm going to ask you something. What's the risk? I said, well, what do you mean? What's the risk? What's the risk is I get fired. I got people who, depend on me and everything else. He goes, well, John, let me paint you two scenarios here. One is, say you go over your CEO's head and you come to me and you have this conversation, early in our relationship here. And it's a terrible meeting. I shred you. I'm like, why the hell are you here? I go tell your CEO and rat you out. He's like, would you have wanted to work for me after that? I'm like, well, no, obviously not. He's like, then would you have made some decisions on your part to go find another job or be happier someplace else? I'm like, yeah, I probably would have. He goes, okay, now let's paint the other side. Say you came to me and we have this conversation. It's a really healthy conversation. Everything's good. Do you think your job for the past year at Staples would have been a little bit easier and our relationship would have been a lot better? I said, yeah, absolutely. He goes, I'm going to ask you again, what's the risk? And it was literally the biggest learning lesson. That hour was my MBA. I walked out of there and I changed. I have 12 personal guidelines to success. And one was have a plan B, which I disagree with. So I changed it to, when you're making decisions, ask yourself, or this is what I ask myself, what's the worst case scenario? What's the risk? And especially, what's the worst case scenario? Because if I can think through the worst case scenario, if I'm okay with that worst case scenario, then I go ahead and I make that decision. If I'm not okay with that worst case scenario, I think of some other options here. Here's an example. Say I'm dealing with somebody who's a non-decision maker, and I know I got to get to the decision maker to be able to get this deal done. What's the worst case scenario? Well, the worst case scenario is I go over this person's head, piss them off, I lose the deal. If I'm okay with that, then I'm going to do it. If I'm not okay with that, I'm going to come up with a different option here. So think to yourself, what's the risk? What's the real risk? And what's your tolerance for risk? And then what's the worst case scenario if you do this? And if you're okay with it, make that decision, all right? Make it happen.